Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be going back to the early 20th century, and we're going to be talking about the the planning and the building of one of America's most famous and recognizable monuments, that is Mount Rushmore. And Chris, when you think of the presidents that grace the front of Mount Rushmore, the faces that grace the front of Mount Rushmore, it's a who's who of presidential greatness. You got George Washington, you got Thomas Jefferson, you got Theodore Roosevelt, you got Abraham Lincoln. I mean, to have one's face up on this mountain, it's sort of symbolic of how great these presidents were.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's interesting about pretty much all of these attractions or monuments or memorials that we discuss is that there's so much history that is found within them. And that Mount Rushmore was basically designed to attract tourists to South Dakota. I mean, and it turned into this whole huge historical thing that, just like most of the other things, had controversy and had some moments of brilliance, and is truly a lifelong legacy that probably everybody should at least have the opportunity to see. I know it's kind of like on my bucket list of places to go, Mount Rushmore. And while you're out there, to be able to see what they call the Badlands. I don't know, that's just got a cool name. And so I'd like to go out there.
Yeah, and you talk about controversy and some of the controversy that existed around Mount Rushmore when it was being proposed and planned was actually who's going to pay for it. A lot of the proposals put forward had either the state of South Dakota, ultimately the federal government paying part of it, but the people paying the other part of it. Sort of the idea that there would be matching funds to pay for the thing, whereas you would have the people pay a certain amount and the federal government would match that. And of course, so this sort of old government spending thing is going to be a controversy then in the 1920s, which it is today as well. But of course, when we think about the building of around Mount Rushmore through the 1920s into the 1930s, of course, that takes us out of the booming 20s and straight into and through the Great Depression. So this monument, Mount Rushmore, is going to continue to be built despite the economic crises that the government and the nation, indeed, is facing in the 1930s.
And what I find so interesting, and I appreciate the way that you did that, because we went right into talking about the federal government and the role that the federal government was going to have on Mount Rushmore. And one of the things that we need to understand in history is how the quote federal government has stepped in to help create these things in the midst of controversy. Because, as I mentioned, one of the places or surrounding this area is the Black Hills, and
Yep.
also the Badlands. And what we need to remember is that this area where this Mount Rushmore was going to be created was actually on land that was owned by the Native Americans. You've got the Lakota, the Sioux, the Cheyenne. And we say, okay, so they own the land, but what's the big deal? And the big deal is that this area was very sacred. It was a place where they prayed, they gathered food to be able to live, they had found the materials to be able to have sustenance, and also they called this area, I think it was known as the Six Grandfathers. And it was called that because you have north, south, east, west, but then also up above and then down below. And so as people are kind of coming in, you've got the federal government who basically walks into this place and says, we're going to take it. It's going to be ours. And so some of the controversy that even can come today about the Mount Rushmore is that, Ray, that this colossal monument dedicated to four very well deserving people was all started by a takeover of land that wasn't even ours, if you will.
Yeah, one of the things when we talk about the Black Hills of South Dakota, one of the things that sort of comes into my mind. If I'm, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, wasn't there gold found in those there hills at one point? And there was controversy even long before this over Americans going into this area.
Yeah, you had what like the 49ers, as you mentioned, the boom, and you had everybody kind of rushing to California because they had heard that there was gold in them hills. And so people start going. But what they started finding is in the Black Hills, there was a lot of gold, and that led to the Black Hills gold rush. And what starts to happen is you also have Custer. Remember General George Custer's last stand, which takes place in this area. And so the government organizes a treaty with the Native Americans. I think it was called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And it basically, I'm going to just use the term because that's the only term I can think of. It screws the Native Americans out of their land. It basically cheats them out of stuff. They make all of these promises, and what happens is this prospector, this guy who kind of is going looking for gold, he organizes this group to kind of find these areas to land or claim this land, if you will, and that will kind of lead into the idea of taking what was known as six grandfathers and turning it into something different.
Yeah, and that's sort of the story of early American history. I always tell my students, and this is not original to me, by the way, I can't take credit for it, but I always tell my students, um, how's the way I word it? It's something along the lines of, you know, the Indians had the land, the Native Americans had the land, and the Americans wanted the land. And the Americans, whether you're talking about the colonists coming over from Europe or as we move into the West, they were willing to do what they had to do to get that land, especially, when gold and stuff is found on it. Now, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say you're talking about because it had gold and the land that they wanted. But
Mhm.
the other thing we have to put in there is, especially towards the latter part going to the west, was the idea that the American settlers believed that God had ordained them to have that land, that manifest destiny, that this was our land. And so they start, as you mentioned, in 13 colonies, and then just start pushing their way. The old picture that shows the angel kind of leading the settlers out west, it was that idea that we're better than you, and that we deserve this land, and we're going to take it. And Ray, I know when we think about that, we kind of look in today's society that those issues still haven't really been settled, if you will. I mean, there's still a lot of what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine kind of a mentality. And we talk about all of this because I think people need to understand you have this huge, beautiful Mount Rushmore, but it was steeped in controversy ever from the very beginning when before the first nose was carved out of it.
Yeah, before the first nose, yes. So let's get to some of the actual stuff related to the planning and actual construction of the site. Um, they had to find a sculptor, and Chris, this is when I look at Mount Rushmore, one of the things I think about is how in the world I'm one of the most unartistic persons you will ever meet. I can't draw a circle. And I look at this and I think, okay, they're using dynamite, they're using drills, they're using chisels to create the image of these presidents. And they don't just simply do it. And you have to sort of imagine, well, that might be Washington, but that could also be Fred down the street. You can look at this and you could say, that is George Washington, that is Teddy Roosevelt. So they had to find a sculptor that could do a good job, and they found it in a guy called, and I'm sorry if I mess up his name, Gutson Borgum. I guess that's how you pronounce his name. He was sort of the sculptor that was going to be in charge of creating this image, but he was also very much a mover and shaker in getting the funding for this project.
And once again, history you didn't know but should. You have this guy that they go to, and by the way, they had originally approached another guy, but he was sick and just said, "Ah, this is a joke. I'm not going to do this." And so you have to wonder what would have
Famous,
happened to that guy if he,
famous
kind of
last words.
yeah. And so, Gutson comes along, but see, Gutson now was busy. He was busy in Georgia. He was known as the sculptor of the Shrine of the Confederacy, if you will, which is, Stone Mountain, Georgia. There's a huge engraving there in Stone Mountain, and he was involved with the KKK. There's a lot of things going on with that individual. And so you have this individual who is asked to travel all the way across these United States to Black Hills to see if it could be carved. And what I find interested is that he didn't choose the mountain that they originally did, that he thought that it would be great in another place that was known as the Needles. But there was a lot of protest in using the Needles area because there was environmental reasons, there were some religious reasons and things like that. And so he then went back and said, okay, I found this place. It wasn't called Mount Rushmore then, but he found this place, a block, if you will, and he said, America will march along that skyline. And he says it's going to have maximum exposure to sunlight. It is actually the most beautiful place you could ever do. And so he begins to create this idea of a sculptor. But Ray, Washington wasn't on his mind when he first began to think about whose faces were going to be on that beautiful work of art.
Yeah, I mean, he's how dare he?
Well, I know that's upsetting to you, but the problem is that, and once again, I think this is history because that the guy who was the secretary of the South Dakota Historical Society, Doane Robinson, he's kind of known as the father of Mount Rushmore. It's his
Yeah.
idea, and so when he and Borgham start talking, Robinson says, "Here's what I want. I want pictures of the old West on these faces." And his idea is he wanted Lewis and Clark, he
Mhm.
wanted Red Cloud, the chief, he wanted Sacagawea, he wanted Crazy Horse, he wanted some of those individuals on there. And I find it interesting that Borglum was like, "No, we're not putting those people on. We're going to put the four presidents that are going to be on there." And I find that to be, once again, interesting because we've already taken the land from the natives. And now we're taking the people that maybe deserve to be on that place. We're taking them off and we're going to put some of the others on. And oh, by the way, this is another interesting fact that I learned. He's working on Stone Mountain, Georgia, when they call him to go to Mount Rushmore. And he basically says, I don't like these people in Stone Mountain. They're criticizing everything that I do. And so he just packs up his tools and
Yeah.
heads out west and works on Rushmore.
And he takes over Rushmore. I mean, he takes over the project. One of the stories that I read about this is President Calvin Coolidge is staying in the Black Hills. He's there for some other thing, and Borgham hires a plane to fly over where the president is staying, which of course nowadays you would not be allowed to do that. But he hires this plane to fly over where the president is staying at a place called State Game Lodge in Custer State Park. And as he flies over, he drops a wreath out of this plane with an invitation to President Coolidge to attend a ceremony dedicating the site that they were going to use for Mount Rushmore. And the interesting thing, Chris, it worked. President Coolidge showed up on August 10, 1927. And when he showed up, he gave or he promised more than what Bulgham was initially asking for. Remember, when he went to the state legislature there in South Dakota, he was asking for matching funds. There'll be donations, private donations. People will pay for half of it. The government will pay for the other half of it. President Coolidge gets there and says, the federal government will pay for the whole thing for this project. And actually, that's going to happen again a few years later when Secretary Mellon comes in and also promises to pay the whole thing. And Borgham No, you're going to, the government will pay half, businesses and private citizens will pay the other half. And there are people who are looking at Borkum going, what are you doing? You know, you've got the federal government, the president, the secretary, I think he was the Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, sort of swooping in saying, we will pay for this project, and you're turning them down. Are you crazy? But he wanted this not just simply to be a government project. He wanted the businesses, the people to have a contribution to this as well, which you know is interesting.
Well, he wanted something that was going to draw people from around the world.
Yeah,
He had the opportunity to carve a mountain. And so I think that it was extremely important, as he said, America was going to march along the skyline. And that led, then after rejecting who you want to be on the mountain, from Robinson and some of the other guys, he says, okay, well, let's choose some of the leaders who have had significant contribution. And so Ray, he goes on there, and we know today that there's four people that are on there, and the reason for these four is that he had four different themes that he wanted to project. He wanted to project the founding, the expansion, the preservation, and the unification of the country, and which I think is brilliant. And up to that point of being able to say, okay, let's focus on those. So when it comes to the founding, of course, Ray, that's your guy.
the
That's
man.
the founding father, who is George Washington. And then expansion, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who basically was responsible for the Louisiana Purchase. And then my buddy, Teddy, Theodore Roosevelt, who was strong about conservation, who loved this particular area, and for preservation of it, along with the industrial blossoming of the nation. And then Abraham Lincoln, who was chosen because he led the country through the Civil War and believed in preserving it. So that's kind of how the four got on there. And I also thought it was interesting that he originally wanted to do their whole bodies. That the goal was to go from at least down to their waist, but as you mentioned, it cost a lot of money, and so they kind of never make it to that point. And I think that Washington is the only one who kind of like goes chin down. I think they kind of, when the money dries up, you got to go higher and higher. And so when you look at Mount Rushmore, you see Washington, who has more, I guess, of a carving than the other guys do.
I saw a explanation of how big these faces are on Mount Rushmore. The mountain itself is 5,725 feet above sea level. George Washington is his face is 21 feet tall. And I think just looking at his eyes and like his mouth was like 18 feet or something across. This is just a very big structure. And it just goes back to how good Gordon and these others must have been to be able to get these faces to look like they actually did. And you know, it wasn't easy. You know, Herbert Hoover comes into office. He sort of hesitates. He has to have his arm twisted a little bit. He puts together a committee. Robinson is left off the committee. Then, of course, Roosevelt comes in, and they actually managed to get some money from the New Deal for this. So you know, they go through a lot to get to this finished product. And like you said, it started with one group of people going to be on the mountain to a totally different group of people, and how exactly it was going to look, you know, did change over time. But you mentioned this earlier. I'm just sort of wrapping around to it that it got a lot of sun, and that was because it's facing the southeast. So it gets more sun than it would if it was facing the other side. So I mean, the whole thing is just ingenious to me that this thing is there, that they made it look as good as it did. It's just to me, it's absolutely amazing.
And that it was 400 workers
Yeah.
that did this, and nobody died. And if you look at some of the pictures of how
Yeah.
they completed this process, is absolutely phenomenal to me.
Yeah.
Some of the way that they would use winches to lower people down, lower people up, and if you did it too fast, their faces would scrape against the mountain that they were carving. They
Mm.
also hired these young boys who would serve as messengers. They would sit on the mountain and yell back and forth, this or that. I mean, you think about it. How do you do? And the fact that they used dynamite. I think there was, I forget how many tons of dynamite were used, but they blasted off like over 450,000 tons of rock. They got off the mountainside.
And some of that rock is still on the ground uh, by the mountain. I mean, not all of it
Still
was
just
carried off;
sitting.
it's still there. Um, and we're sort of running out of time here, so I do want to talk about one thing. How many? Well, there were a lot of different dedications of this. A lot of different dedications of this project. The final dedication was in March 1941. But Chris, did you know that each time they finished a face, they had a dedication ceremony? So 1930, they finished George Washington. They had a dedication ceremony. 1936, they finished Thomas Jefferson. They had a dedication ceremony. In 1937, they finished Theodore Roosevelt. Guess what they did? They had
Maybe
a
a dedication.
dedication ceremony. Yes. In 1939, uh, they finished Abraham Lincoln and had a dedication ceremony. Then 2 years later, in 1941, approximately 2 years later, they had that final dedication. So they were dedicated to this project, Chris.
Oh, I like the way that you did that. And I think there's a couple of other things that we do need to talk about before we kind of move forward, and that is that not everybody was happy that it was just the four guys that were
Yeah,
on there.
yeah.
Since 1937, they have advocated for other people to be on there. They wanted Susan B. Anthony, the women's rights activist. That didn't work. They wanted John F. Kennedy to be on there. They wanted Ronald Reagan. Even recently, they talked about putting President Obama on there, and he said they'll never put me on there because my ears are too large. Of course, Donald Trump, he's
He's
kind of said he
self-advocating.
believes he should be on Mount Rushmore. And I just recently, this month, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said that Joe Biden is a quote, Mount Rushmore kind of president.
Okay. Well,
So let that go in to your
but
minds.
that
Now,
we'll just let that sit there.
I will, but one final thing I think is interesting. People need to go if you ever go to Mount Rushmore and you look at Mount Rushmore. There's all kinds of weird things that are going on with Mount Rushmore. They've put some lights up there now. This really cool LED lighting system. If you look at it closely, some say you can see an elephant. You can see an to the right of Lincoln. If you look at a picture of the mountain 90 degrees, you can see another face. But it's granite and it erodes 1 inch every 10,000 years. So that nose that you were talking about, which is 240 inches long, says it could last 2.4 million years before it completely wears away.
We'll all
So
be we'll all be dead and gone, but
Mount Rushmore will last
it will
7
still be there.
million years, will long be gone. Now,
The
I think
alien
that's,
the
yeah.
aliens will show up, and that's going to be the only evidence so that we ever lived.
I mean, it is a testimony to the fact that all four noses, all four chins, all four foreheads, as well as the eight eyes, the nostrils, the lips, and the ears, they're still intact.
Still there.
And yet
Absolutely.
the refrigerator I bought just a little while ago has already gone out.
Yeah, that's the way it works. They don't make them like they used to.
They don't. They don't. So do
I'm
you think
not. I mean,
anybody?
you talk about adding people to it. I
Yeah.
mean, whether you're talking about Biden or Trump or Obama or whoever, do you think if we added to it, we would actually be able to successfully do it today?
No, I don't, because we would
Yeah.
use the latest technology, and I honestly think it would probably destroy
Yeah.
what was built. So, kudos to everybody for saying, as there's some great people, but just
I'll leave it alone.
not worth it. It's not worth it. And I mean, you go start messing with stat. I mean, that's a whole nother topic, but I mean, leave it as it is.
Just leave it as it is.
Go build another one if you want to.
That's right. All right, Chris. Well, thank you for another great episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. We encourage our listeners to share this episode and our podcast with your family and friends. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.